lot for giving me the opportunity to just talk. I I guess I'll first caveat that the talk is going to be kind of non-technical, even though maybe it's like clickbait. It's about compilers, so maybe you're expecting like a really in-depth talk about compilers, but it's kind of my excuse to talk about other things in programming. And I guess I haven't actually given a talk in I think over a year because I haven't really been to any like online conferences or meetups lately. So hopefully everything I say can still make sense and come across in the same ways. If well, not in the same way, in a true way. Even it would be a lot better if we could meet in person. So yeah, this I'm calling it X is a compiler in quotes just to talk about how um, certain phrases we tell one another and how that might affect our how we see not just programming but I guess life in general. And yeah, feel free to ask questions throughout, but we could do like a Q&A section at the end. I'll try to check to see if I can answer anything quick as we go along. Um, so just a little brief intro on me again. I work on this project called Babel. I actually quit my job at Adobe when I was in New York 3 years ago, almost 3 years ago. And so I've been trying to do open source full time. And if you look at this picture, it's kind of the state of open source at the moment in terms of funding. It does kind of feel like you kind of put your code out there and then you kind of wait for people to kind of randomly give you some tips here and there. But you also know that if you just worked at a company, you could probably just get a salary but I guess I'm choosing to do this obviously because I want to, but yeah. So this talk is going to be about epistemology, which is kind of the study of knowledge. How do we know things? What can we know? And can we know things at all? And just to kind of set the stage, even though I'm going to be talking about programming. So, and a lot of it has to do with confirmation bias. It's kind of like the idea that once you see something, you keep seeing it, it just kind of shows up everywhere, and then people might think you're kind of crazy because, trying to connect the dots and everything. And so if you kind of think about the whole everything as a compiler, I'm just going to show you why that might be the case, at least for me, maybe for you too. So one example of this is, I don't know if anyone's familiar with the GitHub contribution graph. You go to someone's profile and then you see all these like green squares all over the place. And then if you just like search on Twitter or, online, people have posted about this a lot. They keep seeing these like green squares everywhere. You go to someone like a bathroom or some random thing, and then you're like, oh, wow, like that looks like a GitHub contribution graph. So that's just an example of how like, this isn't like going to change your world by seeing this, but it's just saying that like these patterns come up and we kind of latch onto them. And so I think this is explained pretty well in Michael Polanyi has this phrase, we know more than we can tell. He popularized the phrase tacit knowledge, which is kind of this idea, knowledge that we have in our minds, but we might not be able to express it. We kind of have a feeling for what's true or what's right, even though we might not explain it. And so, just to talk about like what is a compiler, definition says that it's a program that converts things to lower level code. And on Wikipedia, it specifically says it's a program that translates computer code from a source language to a target language. That's like the dictionary definition. And Tom Dale, he works on the Ember team. He wrote a blog post about how even compilers are the new frameworks. A lot of the frameworks that are used now, like Angular has a compiler. React is a compiler. Svelte and Vue, these are all turning into compilers. So it seems like a word that people are talking about more, at least even in JavaScript, which is traditionally not been a place where people talk about this stuff. Tensor is a compiler, right? It takes your code and it kind of minifies it, right? Uglify. It turns it into a different form to be used later so that we can ship less code to the browsers. We have Prettier, which kind of does the opposite, right? It takes your code, formats it a different way so that it looks nice. We have Markdown, right? It's a way of taking a language and converting it into HTML or something so it's easier to write like blog posts and all of our READMEs. React, right? JSX, Babel turns JSX into React.createElement. I don't know if anyone's actually looked into like what React is, but once you run Babel through it, it turns into the pane on the right. And even stuff like regex. I don't know if anyone's tried that before, but if you want to figure out how to parse phone number or URL or files, and you can use regex for that. And it's also a way of taking inputs and getting some kind of output. So we have compilers everywhere. I guess one of the problems is that it does feel like a black box. I personally never took a compilers class. I didn't even major in computer science either. I did engineering, industrial engineering, and kind of just learned it on the side. And so traditionally, people recommend that you read these books about compilers, and it has this well-known name that it's called the Dragon Book, and it doesn't really give a lot of confidence into wanting to learn about compilers if everyone's telling you that there'd be dragons, right? And so, thinking about what about Babel? We say that on our webpage that Babel is a compiler. We take your input JavaScript code and we convert it to a lower version of JavaScript, right? ES6 to ES5 or any combination of those versions. And so I guess throughout some of the time that I've been working on Babel, it kind of does. It's kind of like the more that I work on it, the more I kind of see that everything seems to be a compiler. One metaphor that I try to use to explain to people what it's all about. A lot of my friends that are not in tech, they're like, "What do you do?" And I have to say that I work in open source. I can't say that I work at like Adobe or Google, and they're like, "What's open source?" And then you have to explain that it's like Wikipedia for code, and then what project do you work on? I work on this thing called Babel, and so they automatically think that it translates like languages, like English to Spanish or something, and I have to explain that it only converts JavaScript, doesn't even convert other languages. But so the example I use is kind of like, back in the day, I think we did this a lot more back then with Windows. You can change a program to make it run in compatibility mode for older versions of Windows. And that's sort of like what Babel does, right? And I think that's, or, with Word documents, we have docx file extension and the doc file extension. And so, being able to have versions that are compatible is useful. And finally enough, there's even a project that does the exact opposite, and we just call it the Babel backwards, right? It upconverts JavaScript, and that's a useful thing to think through as a mental model. And so, at the very least, Babel is just a translator, right? All we're doing is taking some input and turning it into some other input. It just so happens that both languages are the same language, and we happen to version those languages. And I think this is the best tweet that someone can make about this whole everything as compiler. If you're familiar with like the whole D&D alignment chart thing, on the left side are the different kinds of inputs that you can have. Like the pure input is that like the input has to be a program, but maybe it can be text or maybe it can be anything, and what the output should be. And so, the general thing is like, okay, we have a compiler that takes C and turns it into bytecode. But, a program like a piece of music, right? An orchestra is a compiler. It takes music and it turns into actual auditory music. Or a coin flip or bop it or the sun. Like in that form, it seems like if you want to make the definition really vague, it can be anything. And so and a lot of people might be a lot more. They say you can't say everyone's a compiler, but then you kind of look into it, or you just search it online. Everyone starts realizing, wow, everything's a compiler. My friend just released this project called TabFS, and it lets you mount your browser tabs in Chrome or Firefox into your file system. And this is some form of a compiler as well, right? The tabs show up as literal files in Finder, and you're able to kind of manipulate and view these things. And that's a really cool way of thinking about um, how we should program. And I think it's cool. Like, you can be like, oh, I can manage my tabs through code and write like code to kind of manipulate my tabs. He had the example of what if maybe some of us have hundreds or thousands of tabs open in our browser, and half of them are like Stack Overflow or something, right? And it's like, what if I wanted to only close the ones that are from Stack Overflow? I could write some like command line script that finds these files that are by title and then like remove all of them. But I think the main benefit of this approach is realizing that this interface helps you to kind of think differently about what tabs are or what your browser is, and provides more capabilities. So like this kind of mental models help shape how we think about programming and maybe give us more creative ideas on what we can do. So that's why I appreciate like this kind of thinking. And so you might be wondering like what's the point with all that? And yeah, the point is really just that these metaphors shape how we think, and vice versa, right? These are powerful things that are a big part of our lives. So one example is like time is money. That's something we say, but also within our even programming, right? We talk about how frameworks will save time, or we need to budget this time in the sprint, or have invested time configuring Babel or Webpack or something like that. And so even compiling, we talk about this even in everyday language. When we say we can't parse what someone's saying, or I'm still trying to compile my thoughts, this is an everyday usage. We're still using these concepts, and they change our understanding of what we're doing. And so in this sense, knowledge is literally what we see. It's insight, right? That when we're learning, the process of learning helps us to see the world through that perspective, through that view, and so like even like in this book title, that it's saying that based on who you are, say the government, you will tend to see things through that lens, and then you will make decisions that result from those viewpoints. And so I kind of look at this as a transition from looking to or looking at something to looking from something. And so I think that's the difference between this kind of quote unquote objective view of something, where you're this outside observer, right? You're like the scientist trying to observe like bacteria in the microscope, or when you try to kind of almost embody what the thing you're looking at is. So if you're looking from the perspective of that thing that you're analyzing. And so this matters because when we're using code, when we're writing code, we kind of take on some of the assumptions that the person that made it. So an example from Justin's tweet, if you use Rails, you're kind of learning what DHH, he's the person that made it, kind of quote unquote his ideology, because it kind of shows through the code itself in the framework of how things work, whether it's React or whatever it is. And so sometimes one of the reasons why it's hard to grasp a concept, say in this case, Justin's talking about Redux, is because the mental framework is different from what you have. And so the frustration of having to configure is because there's a, I guess, misalignment between what the creator had in mind when they tried to code this thing and the assumptions that you bring to the table when you're trying to learn it in the first place. And then maybe one of the things we're trying to figure out is like, how do we kind of match those things? How do we teach people in a way that they do understand the concepts behind just like writing out things, so you don't have to just copy paste it because you don't understand what's going on. And so, and I think this gets into this point of programming is a lot about emotions. It's not just a technical thing. Omar, who made the TabFS thing, he told me a story about how he was TAing a class where they were learning C, and he was talking about how a lot of people they use the word dread. They didn't want to use the debugger. They would rather use the equivalent of console.log, because they felt like there was a huge emotional burden on top of trying to like go into this whole new interface and do something different rather than just type out console.log, just check the value of a variable or something. And so, as someone that works on tools, um, it's funny. The only way that people interact with, say, Babel a lot of times is whenever they find that there's an error. When it works, you kind of just assume it's in the background and it's fine. But then every time you're not like happy whenever it works because that's just the default. But then once something goes wrong, then you can complain and you can make a GitHub issue, and then we get into this maintainer user conflict where we're wondering why people are really entitled. But a lot of times, yeah, it's the tool doesn't really help you to feel, spark joy, quote unquote, in when you're writing code, right? And there is some sense that when you finally get it, you could use a religious metaphor. And you kind of feel like you have converted to this religion of React or whatever. I like to say that like a lot of frameworks are like cults, and not even in the bad way, but like there's definitely bad forms of that. But they're, even if it's unintentional, like people are trying to get you to believe or try certain things. And so here, the quote from this passage is talking about in science that people that want to believe something new have to kind of accept it before they even believe it in the first place, or have proof of it in the first place. And someone on the outside might feel like, it's a completely different language. And for a specific example, within faith, C.S. Lewis has, I think, a really great quote that talks about how the reason why he believes Christianity isn't just that the sun has risen, but because the sun as an actual object kind of shines a light on everything. And so when you believe in something, it doesn't have to be a faith, but like whatever it is, you start seeing everything through that glasses, that lens, right? And then going back to the whole everything as compiler, maybe because I spend so much time thinking about it and working in it, it makes me think that I can see why everything could turn into that, just like anything else that we do. And so, another question that I have and you might have is like, well, isn't the whole point to get rid of people in some sense? Like having computers so that we don't have to do the work, outsourcing, making things faster and stuff like that. And I guess a lot of this is just to say that the people are really important to programming, clearly. And we can't just outsource everything. Even in crypto space, using Ethereum, Bitcoin, all that stuff, the blockchain, the point maybe isn't to remove trust, but to give us the option to choose who we should trust. And I think it's similar when we're using programs. We're not trying to get rid of people. We're not trying to, at least I don't want to do that, to create this singularity where people don't matter anymore and that the only thing we interact with is robots and AIs. And I think about this in terms of open source sustainability and kind of how GitHub works and all that. The pictures on the right are, I guess, profile picture, like the automated generated profile pictures when you don't have a picture on GitHub. And just to represent that, a lot of times we interact on GitHub, we don't know anyone on there. And that could be a good thing. The whole point is that, you can just use code and you don't have to talk to anyone, and it's great. But then what happens when we don't really think about who's behind the code? We use all these projects all day long for free. And, you never stop to think like who's even working on this in the first place. How do they make money? Are they doing this for free? Are they doing this for fun? And all this stuff. And maybe some of the problems that we have is because we don't really think about this infrastructure that we have. And knowing how personal it is. Like I like Devin's quote of saying that like this project that he made, she thinks that it's only something that he could have come up with. It's not like anyone could have potentially did it, but because this was something he was interested in, it's like a very personal project. And I think a lot of projects that we do, like side projects, how do we kind of encourage the creativity of each person to be able to make something that's not just like an industrial product. And so when we think about any kind of abstraction, it hides information. That's kind of the whole point. And open source hides dependencies. It hides the people behind them, and that's good. I guess I'm just saying that it's like it's good and bad. When you're driving a car, you don't really need to know how it works. But unfortunately, when it doesn't work, then you kind of need to know, right? You might have to know how to fix it or maintain it, or you can hire someone that the expert that knows. And this is the same thing when we're using someone else's framework or someone else's code. For the most part, you don't have to know how it works. But we're not perfect. We will encounter bugs eventually, and then that's when you have to either figure it out yourself or ask someone, and maybe that's where a lot of the conflict lies. So when we defer that responsibility to other people, what happens, right? Um, and I make this analogy to like our ecosystem and the world, and say like climate change, that kind of stuff. Like even within like say food, we go buy food at the grocery store, or we order it through Seamless, Uber Eats, that kind of thing. We kind of The whole point is you don't have to think about how it works, right? And that's great. You spend your money and you do it. And open source, I download something on npm and I get it. And I guess it's maybe we're just not counting the costs of having that luxury sometimes, right? There's that distance that comes through that we don't recognize the problems with our infrastructure. And I guess you could say that the pandemic kind of showed us a lot of the issues. Um, so what really is the program when we're coding? I guess I'm saying that the results of documentation, even types, if you have it, aren't exactly the program. And I mean, you could even argue the program isn't even the program, if you believe that the people behind the program matter a lot more than the program itself. There is this philosophical phrase to talk about this question: the map is not the territory. Just meaning that if the territory is reality, like the thing that is there, then the maps that we create of it are never going to be exactly what the territory is, right? They're abstractions on top. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't have maps. So the example on the picture is kind of the map that we normally use, the map in blue for our maps, but then the red is kind of the actual size, the physical size of what they are. That's why that Russia, Greenland, Canada look a lot bigger than they actually are, because the mapping between 2D and 3D just doesn't work that well, and there is no exact mapping. There's a funny story talking about how if we had a map that was exact, then the map would just be as big as the actual territory itself, and it would be useless, right? There's no point in having a map where you can't actually put it in your pocket. And so there's like this weird, I don't know, paradox or just like kind of struggle or trade-off that we have of like, we need maps because we need some kind of abstraction to make sense of the world, but then also, they'll never be completely right. It will never be objectively right. And so, yeah, all these things aren't really enough. A lot of, and see, this pursuit of exactness has issues, I guess. We're probably never going to have 100% test coverage. And if you do, it'll still have bugs, right? There are things that you haven't thought of that will happen. People will use your code in ways that don't make sense, right? Your standards, whatever, you work at Google, they're going to have bugs. We all know this. Open source projects have problems. And so, it's kind of like, where are we on this ladder of abstraction of like, how much should we do ourselves and how much should we defer to other people? Should we rely on anyone at all? Should we just do everything ourselves? And clearly that would be, then we can't really get anything done if everything had to be done from us. Like the whole meme about like, you're not a real programmer if you didn't do whatever, like you didn't, make your own language, or you didn't compile this code or make your own operating system or whatever. Even in philosophy, there's like a similar strain from where this comes from, is like, the only thing that I can believe is that I exist and that I think. But that means that you doubt everything. You can't trust anyone outside except for yourself. And so when we seek this certainty, we kind of lose the subjectivity of being people and like the experience that all of us have. And so Yeah, similar to when we see that code is just code. Technologies are just things. They're just artifacts. Um, I guess yeah, I rather see that these are metaphors that kind of extend how we interact with the world, how we live. Um, I don't know if anyone saw that movie Soul that came out recently, Disney Plus, but they actually mentioned the same like story in the movie and talking about how there's like an older fish that talks about to the younger fish, how's the water? And they interpret this quote differently, but the younger fish is asking what's water because they don't actually realize they've been in water their whole life. Um, they didn't have a name for it. They don't really understand the environment that we're in. And a lot of times we can't because, it's not a conscious thing. We're trying to make our Tower of Babel to have control, to have objectivity, and that's a good pursuit. But like sometimes there's a cost to that. So yeah, we can't really question everything. You kind of have to take some things on faith. Um, and this is kind of summed up in this quote that all models are wrong, but some are useful, right? None of them are going to be completely right, but we have to use them. And trying to tie this back to programming because I know that probably most of this is very abstract. Um, I thought, a great essay called "Programming as Theory Building" that kind of talks about this idea that we tend to think of programming as about code. It says the common notion is programming is about a text, and we tend to think like open source is code. And he's trying to present this idea that um, that programming is about kind of the mental models that people have about code. When we talk about reading, we don't really say that reading is just about memorizing what's in there, because I read a lot of books that at the end of it, you finish the book, right? And then you're like, what was even in that? I maybe had a good feeling about it. Maybe you thought it was boring. But if someone asked you like, oh, what was on chapter 1 or chapter 5 or whatever, you probably wouldn't know exactly. But, it changed something about how you see things if it actually affected you. And so I kind of like what Nadia says. It's not really about what you remember necessarily, but how it shapes your thinking. And it's great to be able to memorize quotes and stuff like that too. Um, and so, I mean, Bruce Lee wasn't actually a programmer, but I think he had a lot to say. He actually was not just a martial artist, but he studied philosophy in college. And I like his depiction of how we might progress from learning. He kind of breaks it down in 3 stages: the primitive stage, the mechanical stage, and what he calls artlessness. In the first stage, when we're programming, we're starting to learn programming. Everything is based on your own intuition, and you don't really know what's out there, so you kind of just play around, do some stuff, right? You copy paste, and it works. And eventually, you're like, okay, maybe I need to take a course, watch some YouTube videos, go to Codesmith, like these kinds of things, and you learn the principles. You learn these things like try, don't repeat yourself, and then you apply that thing everywhere, right? Because that's like the only thing you know. And the expert told me that I'm supposed to, when I kind of like write the, I don't know, a variable 5 times, I should make it into an array or something like that. But then later, when you kind of learn the principles and what they really mean, you start figuring out that the answer to a lot of things is it depends. Before the answer is like it's always try, like always don't repeat yourself. And then later you're like, oh wait, that only applies in certain situations, and there's no obvious solution. Um, this is just galaxy brain meme. At the beginning, you're asking yourself, how should I test my code? At first, you're like, no, of course, I'm just gonna write it out and do whatever. And then later, you're like, once you learn about TDD and test-driven development, you're like, everything has to be tested, right? I need 100% code coverage. And then eventually, you're like, okay, maybe I don't need to do it all the time. And yeah, like that last picture, the best thing you can do is just delete everything because then you don't even need tests, right? So yeah, a lot of coding isn't really about coding. Um, and I find that to be the case the more I do it. Not that it doesn't matter. Of course, that's the whole core of it, but there's like all this other stuff on top that matters too. And so, if a big part of programming is the theory of the program itself, how it works, then that also means that the people that work on that code matter a lot. Meaning that it's almost the fact that like that the thing, the model, the theory is stuck in their head. And you would know this if you've ever worked on a project with someone, especially if you work at a company, right? And this person made that feature, that project, and they leave, and then now you're stuck being the new person on that team. You're gonna have to figure out how that works, and you wish that you could like call them, right? Like, and then ask them all these questions, but then they're gone. And the only thing you can do is get blame, go through the history, try to figure out, piece together all these issues in PR to see like how it works. So clearly, even if they tried to document all of it, it's still a lot of missing parts because they weren't able to express everything that was in their head into the code itself. And yeah, so how do we think about how technology can help us kind of have a second brain, or how do we extend um, ourselves into these other things? Um, yeah, random analogy. I was thinking about how there is a sense where tools kind of help distance ourselves from, people before ate with their hands, and now we use chopsticks or we use utensils, and people have this feeling where like, oh, I don't feel as close to the thing that I'm doing. Or how like a lot of people are like with music, it's so easy to download any music or listen to it through streaming and Spotify, and then people want to buy like vinyl or something, or from touch screens to buttons. It's a similar thing. Um, Polanyi tries to explain this concept in what he calls indwelling. It's kind of like taking a concept and learning to live in that, right? To kind of embody that in your life. Um, you know, to live through something rather than try to find the answer, which is a very abstract notion. And Bruce Lee again, he has this really interesting phrasing, right? That at the end, and it's very like kind of new agey, but like, be water, because it becomes the shape of the thing that it's contained within. Um, and so I guess my takeaway is kind of like trying to learn to see that tech and a lot of things are not static; they're dynamic things. They change, and just as we change. Um, there's a really cool story that Dan put on the right about how this shrine that every year, or not every year, but every generation, they actually destroy the whole building and they rebuild it. And the reason why is because even though you could have wrote down the docs on how to make a house or whatever, they know that even if they did that and the people that knew how to make it, they left, no one would know how to actually create this thing. And so there's this kind of process knowledge that's built up by the act of actually doing it in the first place that is retained through these, I guess, traditions or rituals or what you want to call it. And so you could say that there is like a cycle of life and death within programs. And in this article, it says that the programmer team only like the program's only alive when the person that first made it still basically understands how it works. Um, and then what happens is the program essentially dies when when those people don't really know how it works anymore. And that in some sense that could happen immediately, right? Like once you kind of put it out there and you look at it a week later, you're like, who wrote this? And you're like, oh wait, that was me. It wasn't like someone else, right? Um, and so you know the revival of that program happens, right, when there's a new team that creates a different model about how they think that program works. And he also points out that programs that are dead can still output. Programs that are dead can still be useful. There are plenty of, like say you never updated Babel or whatever, it still works, right? It still runs on whatever computers are working. But then what happens is if you start doing things that it didn't account for, then of course you're going to encounter bugs, and then you're going to have to ask someone to fork it and make a new version that fixes that problem. But yeah, things have to change over time, and you're going to think of new use cases, and that's why maintenance is such an important part. It's not just the initial thing. And so all this to say that like sometimes we we tell, or other people might say that programmers can, be substituted, right? And I guess all this is like an argument to say that um, whoever started it or was working on something, they can't be substituted, clearly. Um, and why they are valuable, and why in almost any job, like those people, um, you can try to kind of like, if everyone quit or whatever and you hired some new people, yeah, they could try to figure it out, but ultimately it would be a lot less successful than if those same people were there before. Um, and this is a random analogy because I just like the title of this book, The Cat and the Toaster. I mean, everyone loves cats, right? And so I think it's a good question to ask yourself. It's like, is the thing we're thinking about, is it a living thing or is it like a very, an inanimate thing, But when I think about something as complicated as a city, um, or the environment, right? Or open source, right? These are not just buildings. These just aren't resources or code. These are complicated ecosystems that have intertwining, things that are not solved just because like we change some numbers around or something, right? And I think that's a good thing to think about when we're thinking about like how we want to improve a system. And so, yeah, so it's kind of like how do we see the world, and how does that affect how we see programming, or the things that we want to kind of do. I think, okay, yeah, I think that's it. And I know that didn't really, I don't know if that ended with like there's no takeaways. It's just kind of a lot of thoughts, kind of like that picture I had in the beginning. I don't remember with the stuff everywhere. Yeah, that's kind of like how I'm seeing everything right now. But yeah, thanks. I need to find where this is. It's like very beginning. Where is it? It's like the first. Oh yeah, this one. Yeah, it kind of looks like this. Yeah. But yeah, if you have questions, feel free to ask.
I am definitely still processing all of that information that was just given to me. But if folks do have questions, we can go ahead and use the raise hand feature, and then Henry, feel free to just call in folks.
Let's see, I haven't. Still compiling this one. Do I just ask people to unmute, or I guess is that how this works? I haven't
Yeah,
even.
go for it. So I think
Okay,
Lakshay, I see your
Lakshay.
hand raised.
Okay, cool.
Can you guys hear me okay?
Mm-hmm.
Cool. Thanks for the presentation. I just have a question for a developer looking to try to start contributing to like an open source project, or maybe start their own open source project. But I think maybe more so focus on the contributing side. Like, what kind of advice do you have for like how to, especially for you, like if it's your first time kind of getting into that, actually helping the open source community instead of just being a user. Yeah.
Cool. Yeah, thanks. Good question, actually. It's funny. There's like a lot of like I don't know, like rote things I could say, but like the common advice, and I agree with this, is that you should, at least in terms of what project to work on, is just pick something that you already use, right? Or something that you're familiar with, because given that all that stuff I said that people are still trying to compile, it's like context matters a lot, right? If you know how something works, if you've heard about it, there's just like these things that kind of you tacitly are kind of absorbing that make it easier for you to kind of get what's going on. And I think that helps a lot more than just because this project is popular or whatever, right? And it's okay if it's not a project that's like, I mean, in some sense, it's better if the project isn't that popular because, like, the really popular projects are probably really busy in the sense of there's lots of people trying to do the exact same thing. So if you can find like a more niche thing, um, like there's this weird scale. Like when a project's really small and no one's really using it, and then you make, assuming this person is active at all as a maintainer, if you said that I'm using this thing, I think it's really cool, they will probably go out of their way to want to help you because there are no people actually talking to them about their project, right? So like say Elmar, he just released his tab FS thing. And he wasn't sure that it was going to be like really popular. I mean, but now he's feeling overwhelmed because suddenly, hundreds of people are downloading your thing, and it's exciting in the beginning, but there's like this kind of threshold where, you only have so much time in the day. If 100 people went up to you and told you like, hey, can you help me with doing open source, you might not be able to do it. But if there's only one person, then it'd be a lot easier. Um, and I guess, and I understand, and I felt this too. There's a huge intimidation factor in terms of like, even like making a GitHub account, writing something in the issue and like pressing enter, like knowing that like, oh, everyone's gonna see this, they're scrutinizing, like, did I like spell this right and stuff like that. Um, I don't know what else to say to that other than like, I guess once you do it, and hopefully the people that you are interacting with are understanding enough to feel, I mean, they should. I mean, um, I think that, yeah, that is something you kind of over time you'll get more used to, and eventually it's weird. Like when I'm kind of making issues or talking, it's almost too casual. Like I'm like, I don't even care that there are typos or whatever, just because I just want to put something out there. If that makes sense. But yeah, I don't know. If you have a follow-up question, feel free to. I don't know if that answered anything.
Yeah, I have a quick follow-up. Like on
Mhm.
the issue side, like, do you think it's okay to like write up an issue for like for some kind of project, and then also offer to like try to fix it, even if like you have not had much
Oh,
experience
okay.
before?
Yeah. No, that's an awesome question. So you're saying that the scenario where you've maybe found a bug or something, and then you at the end, the second line, you're like, okay, I'm willing to work on this if you help me or something.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, no, okay, that's awesome. Like I think a lot of, I mean, depending on the project, I think a lot of people they want more help, clearly, but also it's more fun when they see that other people are interested. So if you said that I'm willing to put in the time to learn this if you help me, then I think that, and I don't think there's anything wrong with just saying that at least, right? And if they do, that'll be great. And I think that's a lot better than just like trying to like look through issues or trying to read the docs and stuff. To me, the best thing to do is somehow get connected with like an actual maintainer, and hopefully maybe they set aside time to be able to kind of work with people where like, oh, this is like we're going to onboard new people or something like that. Like building that kind of personal connection, assuming they are okay with that. I think that'll help build more confidence than just kind of doing it on your own, right? Because like knowing that like someone is kind of looking out for you or kind of see that you're interested in kind of working, and they'll take time, of course, but like I think, and once you get into one project, it'll be a lot easier to kind of get into other and move on and stuff like that. But yeah, good
Awesome.
question.
Thank you.
Okay. I'll do Elise, I think. I'm not sure if that's
Oh.
any.
Yeah, that's fine.
Cool.
Thank you for the talk. I kind of wanted to go back to like the religion of Redux and
Okay.
just I wanted to ask, I guess, it seems like there's so many new things, even in React, like even once you've got into React as you're like, wow, I seem to like understand what's going on here. React is changing all the time. And I'm just wondering, I don't know, what are your thoughts about all the constant changes to front-end frameworks and stuff?
Okay. So the question is that, yeah, especially in JavaScript, everything's changing. I don't know what to say. I guess there is some sense that it's always been this way in a weird way, and I feel like because people that have been in, I guess, doing this for a longer time, they're actually that's kind of funny. People that are new, right, to something, they see that there's constant change. But then also people that are really old, not like in age, but like just in time they've been in here, they also think it's going really fast too. Because I guess if you're not caught up or you're not the one actually making this change happen, then it looks like everything's really fast. So there's a lot of people that used to do web development like say 20 years ago, right? They're using HTML, CSS, JavaScript at the very primitive in terms of like what you're allowed to do, and they come back and they're like, what happened to web development and stuff like that. But then if I, as someone that I'm mostly front end, I look at like DevOps or server stuff, there's always new stuff there, and I feel like it's overwhelming too. So I don't know if I have like, it's not really advice. I guess it's just saying that like everyone feels that way. If you're not in the know, I guess, of that thing. And I also don't think that like you should feel, and I think this is a cultural thing that we have a hard time with. I don't know how we kind of change that, but like, yeah, I think that there's definitely a pressure to feel like you need to know everything that's going on. Maybe even do open source. Like I don't, obviously, it's funny. I'm doing open source full time. I'm not going to tell people not to do open source, but I also don't think that everyone has to do open source either. It's not like an obligation. But I do see that there are certain things where like companies, they'll ask for your GitHub and like stuff like that, and then you feel a certain pressure to like do it. That's totally understandable. Um, I don't know. Maybe it's kind of like finding your niche. Maybe like once you find the thing that you're interested in, you will naturally not really care about all these other things that are going on in other spheres, right? And kind of just focus on your thing. And I think maybe that's similar to social media, right? Like everyone's posting about everything in, say, Instagram, like everyone's like, seems like their life's amazing, right? And then you only see the kind of the good things that have happened through that, but not the bad, but just like kind of the everyday stuff like that. So yeah, just random thoughts. Oh, okay. Uh, I think I clicked on.
Hey there, can you hear me?
Yes.
Great.
Hey there.
So yeah, I guess I had a question kind of following up to that one, and I wrote up a little question in the chat as well. So I guess one of the things that kind of stuck to me in this talk was the idea that you have to believe in something almost as like without like almost like faith, right? Like this is a good way to go about doing whatever I'm trying to do. And so I guess the idea, like whenever you do something frustrating, so there's a disconnect. Do you think that as kind of time goes on, we're approaching kind of a similar paradigm, or eventually like we're going to have the same idea? Or do you think we're losing touch? And I guess a follow-up to that, you mentioned JavaScript as being like something where there's a ton of stuff going on. I guess, what are your thoughts on that?
Can you, I guess I'm having a hard time. Do we think we're slowly approaching a similar paradigm? I guess, what do you mean? Or just keep going on.
I guess, yeah. So I guess the idea of similar paradigm where maybe as like the evolution of ideas starts like iterating through like bad approaches kind of give way to a new approach.
Are you talking about in general or?
Yeah, I guess it's in general, like as ecosystems start developing.
Oh, okay. So are you saying like, do you think that over time, like say programming as a whole is moving towards like one thing or like separate things or something like that?
I guess not necessarily like going towards one thing, but having a similar, I guess, the religion that everybody would believe in. I guess as an example, so say something like, from what I know, I don't know too much about Ruby, but the idea is that they have a similar paradigm for how it should work. And the idea would be that you could be able to go into any Ruby program and generally have an idea for how it works. Whereas with JavaScript, like it's really just a lot of different ideas and you're just getting thrown into all these different things.
Yeah.
And so whether we're increasing in like more people are contributing more ideas and things are just gonna, start polarizing, or eventually we'll kind of coalesce.
That's an interesting question. I kind of think about like, and I don't really have anything to say about politics, but it's like I guess there's that question too. But in terms of programming, I don't know. Like, if you think about JavaScript, like you said, it is kind of you could consider it like a mishmash of like all these different languages. Like, JavaScript is kind of weird. It's kind of like this kind of very democratic way of programming in the sense of there's a lot more people at the table for JavaScript rather than like some other languages created by one person or like some committee. At least the committee on JavaScript is pretty active on Twitter because of Babel. We can theoretically anyone can propose a new idea, like a new syntax, right? And then they could like tell someone, and then maybe it can be implemented. And then you could even make a plugin in Babel that makes that new syntax. and that might eventually become part of JavaScript, which is kind of amazing, right? Like you don't typically think of a language as something you can have influence over, let alone make a whole feature, even though it might take like 2 years or something. And and I think because of JavaScript's I guess position in all of programming, maybe a lot more languages are kind of doing that. Like they feel more like they want to get input from the community. And there's definitely a balance, because you can criticize and say, well, why are you bringing in more people that don't really know anything about languages to try to program languages? And so there's that balance of like, same problem we're talking about with the internet and censorship and that kind of stuff, like free speech. Like it's kind of a similar thing. Like do we want everyone to have a say in everything? Or do we think that the quote unquote experts, they don't know what they're talking about? Because, and say for JavaScript, maybe a lot of them, they don't even write JavaScript anymore. Some of the people might be only people that think about languages. So they're like programming language experts. But they might not actively write like websites. And so I think JavaScript has done a good job as of late of making the community composed of more different groups of people. So like there used to be only the language designers, and now there's like the browser implementers like Chrome, Firefox, and then also what we call like just, I guess, regular programmers, right? They might not know that much about language design, but they can tell you like how we're using JavaScript. And then maybe even bringing like educators, like why introduce a new syntax that no one knows how to teach or understand very easily? So I don't know if, that didn't really answer the question. Maybe it's like, I don't know if anything is necessarily converging on anything. You could argue that it is, in terms of like kind of, I don't know, winner takes all effect of JavaScript being like the only language you can use in the browser, but then now we have like WebAssembly. And so I don't know, I feel like there's definitely reactions to what's going on. And it's kind of up to like, surprisingly, like, a few people to kind of push for different ways of thinking about things, right? And maybe going back to that thing of questioning, like, why are we doing something this way? And then kind of talking about it to people, and everyone being okay with talking about, why is this the way it is, and trying to learn the history of like how this came to be. And that's a lot more, that's a lot more work. It's a lot easier to just go with the flow, I guess. But if you're thinking about like what's different, there are lots of different languages that do things that are completely different than, the popular thing, right? Yeah. I think I had some other questions in chat. Let's see. But okay, let me do this first.
Hey.
Hey there.
First of all, thanks a lot for the talk. I really loved it. And it made me think that there are lots of things that we tend like not to see. For example, that question of who's behind the code, right? That's something that we usually don't think about.
Yeah.
So I wanted to ask you if you have any like, I don't know, techniques or recommendations about making these things more visible. For like you and your team to be more aware of them while working on stuff.
Okay, so your question is what ideas on how to make people more visible?
Yeah, people, and maybe ideas that we tend not to see. I think you partially answered that when you talked about in the last question, like learning about the history of things and so on. But yeah.
Yeah, no, that's a great answer. It's kind of like the trade-off I said again. Like, there's definitely a value to being anonymous. Some people don't want people to know who they are for various reasons, harassment, that kind of stuff. But I do feel like, if you have a place where you can feel comfortable, or you could be yourself, that being able to see people's names, like in this case, you see people's names, you see their face, maybe you see that where they're like their time zone, something like that. It will help the thing be more personal and more intimate, and you'll feel like connection with people. And so I don't know, like GitHub doesn't really do that much. I mean, I think there are some recent things they've done, having statuses and having a page where you can like kind of like your GitHub resume or README kind of thing. But if you think about the interface is very transactional. Like we call the things that you create issues. They're inherently kind of a negative feeling, and people have suggested, oh, we should make like an encouragement tab or something. Um, I don't know. It's like I kind of I kind of fall back on meeting in person, and unfortunately, you can't really do that because I feel like that kind of lowers a lot of barriers. So I think, yeah, we do need to be more creative around how do we create digital experiences that kind of not substitute what was physical. Clearly, I don't think that can happen, but trying to take advantage of digital spaces that maybe can be better than physical spaces in other ways. So like say Zoom, I have a few examples, and I have a friend even that he made a startup around. I think a lot of people are doing this. Like there's a whole Zoom fatigue, right? Um, how do we make spaces that are more spatial even? And we can learn a lot from video games here. Uh, like there are virtual worlds where people live in, and there's even like landmarks where you can know where you are. In Zoom, it's just this abstract little thing where we're all little like squares. You don't even know who's looking at who because it's just like it looks like everyone's looking at each other. It's weird. And also, if you have your self view on, um, you're not looking at yourself in the mirror when you're talking to people. But in Zoom, you have to like hide it, otherwise it's just like awkward. Um, but yeah, so this whole idea of proximity chat is actually really cool. Um, and if anyone has played Among Us, there's like a mod for that too. And it seems like there's a lot of games that have implement that. Um, you know, it's a limitation. Being able to only talk to a certain amount of people, right, is a good thing because it creates small groups rather than this. Like right now, it's a kind of a one to many thing, and and maybe you probably don't even feel like you could actually talk to me because of the format in which this thing works, right? Other than through chat and stuff like that. But yeah, I guess yeah, figuring out how to make like these smaller spaces could be a good thing.
Thanks a lot for the answer.
Yeah.
Hey, Henry. This is Joel. I'm a Codesmith grad, cohort 6. Thanks for being with us today. So I'm not sure what cohort we're at now and where folks are at in the program, but for those that are looking at making some career choices down the road, just wanted to see if you could expand on what you touched on about kind of like your experience being full-time in open source and, what made you go that way? And like you said, might not be for everybody. So maybe what are some of the, the benefits and some of the drawbacks of your experience?
Yeah, for sure. Okay, so the question is around like just getting into open source full-time, stuff like that. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, pretty much. It's just, your experience.
Okay, cool. Yeah, this is something that I guess it's like, it's kind of weird because I suppose, I mean, it's hard to know that you're in a unique position. And I like to bring up survivorship bias a lot. Because, like if I go up here and I'm like, oh, you should all quit your job and do open source, that doesn't mean that it's going to happen. And I also don't want to say don't do it because then it's like, are you trying to prevent people from doing open source? It's weird. But going back to like why I did this. So I was working at Adobe, and some background is because I didn't mention it. So I'm from Atlanta. I graduated from Georgia Tech, and then I tried to get a good job at Google, all that stuff. I didn't end up getting into any of those because I wanted to move to California at the time. And so I started contributing to open source, and people are asking about this. I think a big reason why I even did it at all was because my coworker who basically sat next to me, they were doing a lot of open source, and I kind of just, I guess osmosis, right? You just start talking about stuff, and they're like, "Hey, maybe you should contribute." And for me personally, all I needed was someone, in person to tell me you should do it, and that was enough. I don't think that's necessarily true for everyone because I'm thinking about me going back to find a random issue on Angular 1 and trying to just figure it out. That's a horrible experience. But being able to talk to someone about it, like in person or maybe through chat, was encouraging. And I think a lot of, to me, is like, how do you kind of create a space where people can feel enough that you can, I mean, it's going to be hard and there's a lot of mistakes, just like in programming where we're always encountering like bugs or errors and stuff like that. It's going to be not that different in open source, but if you have, a cohort or a group of people around you that are kind of doing the same thing, I think that'll help a lot. And so through that experience, I actually ended up working on this project called JSCS, which is a linter, sort of like ESLint. And it's already dead because we ended up merging that project into ESLint, which is something that people use now. And then what happened was I got an email randomly from my friend Joel, who worked at Adobe, and he was like, "Hey Henry, we've been like kind of talking and working together online for like basically more than half a year." He's like, "Would you want to work at Adobe?" And this is like kind of random. I wasn't even looking for a job, so that was like an amazing, opportunity that kind of just came out of nowhere. And I kind of hated the idea of moving to New York, and that's the whole thing because I just didn't understand anything about it. And I'm still here, so obviously I liked it. But the reason why I went there was because I was like, oh, this is a company that cares about open source. They found me through open source, so I think I should maybe give it a shot. And it's Adobe. That seems like a great place. And ended up going there, and I thought I would work on open source, but they didn't really give me opportunity because typical company stuff. I don't really fault my team, but I guess it's a company thing of like, it just doesn't help the business, quote unquote. But I somehow got the courage to kind of ask my boss. I was like, hey, can you let me do this halftime? Because we use this at work. It's really important to our builds or our company. If you want like a bug fix or whatever, a feature, it seems weird to kind of wait for me to do it on the weekend or something instead of just like be like, hey, Henry, we need this thing. Let's just let you work on it at work, right? And I offered that, and it's sort of like asking your boss for like a salary increase or like any of that. It's like I was like shaking, I think, at the time. It was funny, but they were very nice, and in terms of just like understanding the ask, and they clearly understood open source because I don't think most people would ever even say okay, and they ended up saying we'll let you do it halftime. And long story short, I was able to do that, and that was already a great like opportunity. Most people could probably never do that. And eventually I got to the point where I felt like it was weird that my job was like half my job was different from the rest of the company. And not that anyone was mean or anything. It's just that it's weird if you're focused half your time on this thing that you care about a lot and no one does, they don't really care about, right? They're focused on the next task or the conference or whatever. And it's no fault of anyone. It's just the scenario made it feel like I was kind of between two different places and I kind of needed to just pick one, right? Maybe just stop doing open source at work and just do it for fun, or try to do this other thing. And I ended up just doing the other thing. And that was a long tangent to say the reason why I quit. I mean, there's a lot of reasons, but like one of them was just, I guess I saw a lot of potential in what quitting would lead to. Personally, I had a lot of conviction around open source and what I wanted out of open source for myself and for the greater community. And I think there's a lot of problems that haven't been solved. I don't think they're going to be solved like just because I did it, but like I want to be a part of that. And I felt like it would give me enough mental space to be able to like think about these things. If it's not really about like necessarily money, but obviously you have to think about that. The opportunity is there where like, if you're working at whatever, you're going to have to think about the problems that they're thinking about, right? And I wanted to work on these other problems. And so I felt like it was worth a shot, to kind of take that leap. And of course, you told my parents, like you tell everyone in your company, they're like, wow, this is like, it's just weird to even consider doing it. But I figured that I guess I'm relatively, just practically speaking, relatively young. I think I could probably just get a job anyway. And that's not something that a lot of people can say. So I'm like, the reason why you would take a risk is because you have the option to. And so let's leave the option not open, but like just take it. and also, you know, there's other things around, like I felt like I could pursue my other interests around, like I mentioned the podcast that I'm doing about, like, I guess open source and other things, like whether faith or the kind of things. Like I started realizing kind of like what I mentioned earlier about um the confirmation bias stuff. Like I was able to kind of put together, oh, you know, serving in a church is not that different from serving in open source in some sense, right? You're doing it for free most of the time. You're trying to help people. Um, there's a lot of trust involved, right? Stuff like that, and it kind of built these connections, and I felt like that could only happen because I left. And so, you know, it's a different way of living. It's a different career path. It's kind of weird even calling it a career path, I guess. But, you know, I think a lot of people's desire, and understandably, is to work at a Facebook or Google. And I guess I had the opportunity to do that and realize that, I guess, the whole thing of like, you know, I can work here for a long time, but like, do I even want to do that anymore? And uh, you know, I guess I figured that I already kind of knew what would happen if I stayed for a long time. It's sort of like, if you can already predict what's going to happen, then you might not even go for it anymore, right? And there's this other unknown, which is simultaneously really scary because you have no idea what's going to happen. But then also, because you don't have any idea what's going to happen, there's like a potential that could be good, and there's a risk involved. And I think the payoff, if you, I hate using the word payoff because it has to do with money, asymmetrical. It means like I can do this thing, and I think that it can result in a lot of good. I meant even just like mentally too. You know, all of us want to work on things that are meaningful, right, in our lives. And I'm not going to say it's open source because, you know, you have different values or different goals than me. But I felt like open source to me, kind of something in there, you know, like I said, it's vague, um, had values that I appreciated, you know, whether it's, uh, you know, giving things away for free, helping people, you know, doing things that kind of shape society or whatever. And you can argue a lot of it is bad because, and this is something I still struggle with, of like, you know, a lot of people can use open source, but then also companies can take advantage of that, and they don't give anything back, and they use that for bad a lot of times. But like, and that's a personal thing that we all have to deal with, whatever work we do, I suppose. Um, but yeah, I don't know if that I should answer that. Yeah.